Lucy. Shakoach. What an important Devar Torah, Lucy. I love that you are calling us to have a Jubilee year this year. After all that we've been through, and including the ways you talk about how we've been resensitized to some of the injustices and imbalances in our world and in our society. So I want to say a few words in response to your call to us. First of all, I love that you connected rest to freedom and Shabbat to Shemitah to Yom Kippur to Yovel, Jubilee. I love that you brought us two evocative teachings about Teruah, the shofar sound that, according to, as you taught us, the Nechemta of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, is the sound of the breaking of the chains of slavery. And according to Ketav Kabbalah, the sound of fellowship and friendship. I want to come back to this relationship between freedom, rest, and fellowship in a moment. But first, I want to think more about the aspect of breaking the chains of slavery that so poetically is in the shofar's Teruah on Yom Kippur and in the Yovel, the Jubilee. Because your Torah portion today, Bahar, which includes the Jubilee year, is actually paired with the next portion in Torah, Bechukotai, and this portion itself has both the release of slaves in the Jubilee, but also it has verses that were used by both Jews and Christians for many centuries to justify slavery and to say that it was ordained by God. So we have this strange situation where we have a Torah portion that both calls for us to release all slaves and has verses that became the historical justification for slavery itself. Chapter 25, verses 44 to 46 say, V'avtecha v'amatecha asher yulach me'et hagoyim asher seviv techem mehem tiknu eved ve'ama. It is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. These shall become your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property for all time. Such you may treat as slaves. But for your Israelite kinsmen, no one shall rule ruthlessly over the other. In other words, here in this week's Torah portion, according to these verses, Jews and later Christians could own non-Israelites as slaves in perpetuity, passing slaves as property to the next generation. Small numbers of Jews did go on to own slaves throughout the centuries, and Jews played a small role, and some scholars say a minuscule role, in the slave trade, but Jews were present in the slave trade. Now, it's important to note that anti-Semitism has played a role in the perception of Jews and the Jewish role in slave trading and slave ownership from the Middle Ages to today. And Jews were disproportionately blamed for slavery throughout our history. In 1991, the Nation of Islam, a Black Muslim group led by Louis Farrakhan in the United States, put out a false study about the Jewish role in the slave trade called The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which alleged that Jews dominated the transatlantic slave trade. This is simply not true. However, Jews were slave owners in Brazil, in the Caribbean, particularly in Suriname, and to a small degree in the southern United States. Historians say Jews were just 1.25% of slave owners in America. But according to an article by Ken Yellen in The Forward in 2015, before and during the Civil War, Jews in New York, which even then New York was the largest population of Jews in the country, were either silent about slavery or mostly supported the South in slavery and in the war. Judah Benjamin, who was the Attorney General of the Confederacy and Robert E. Lee's right-hand man, was Jewish. And Rabbi Morris Jacob Rafal was an outspoken defender of slavery in the South, citing these verses from this week's Torah portion to make the case that slavery was endorsed by the Bible and by God. On the other hand, many Jews were outspoken abolitionists in the United States and in England. A Jewish woman named Ernestine Rose was called the Queen of the Platforms for her fiery oratory against slavery in the United States. And Rabbi David Einhorn, a Reform rabbi, was an outspoken abolitionist and challenged Rabbi Rafal, the defender of slavery, to a public debate, arguing that the Bible really stands for justice and freedom for all. The teruah sound of the shofar has at least two other meanings than the ones that you taught us this morning, Lucy. In the Talmud, in Rosh Hashanah 33b, the teruah represents the sound of Sisera's mother upon seeing her dead son. In Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the teruah represents Sarah's anguished wail when she thinks that Isaac has been killed by Abraham on Mount Moriah. What's interesting here is that these two cries of two mothers, one, our foremother Sarah, and the other, the mother of an enemy general, are coming to make the sound of the shofar into the sound of grieving. But the two mothers are united, even though across their differences, by weeping for their dead or perceived as dead children. Think about how much weeping has taken place on these shores since the first slaves arrived here. Think about how many mothers have wailed over their dead children even since the abolition of slavery. Deaths through lynching and incarceration and police violence and so much more. In this way, the teruah represents both the breaking of the chains that we are talking about for the Jubilee and that we celebrate, and the consequences wrought over centuries of those chains. The cries of human anguish from those chains and their legacy. So it's not an accident that the Yovel, the Jubilee, is marked by the same teruah that we hear on Yom Kippur. It is done on Yom Kippur. It is announced on Yom Kippur with that sound. Because Yom Kippur is our day of atonement, our day of truth-telling, our day of repentance, our day of reckoning, and yes, our day of forgiveness. Next week, I have the honor of interviewing Heather McGee, who used to head up Demos, a policy think tank in Washington that works for economic justice and against economic inequality. McGee has written a book called The Sum of Us. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a New York Times bestseller, and the Obamas are actually making it into a podcast for their Higher Ground podcast. Through extensive research, McGee proves in this book the point that American racism has hurt white people as a whole, not just Black people. McGee documents how the policies that built the middle class in America have been largely dismantled over the last 40 years because of racism, because white people didn't want to share the resources of those policies with Black people. Those policies mostly started with the New Deal, and the benefit of the policies were largely restricted to white people at the time of the New Deal. And when the civil rights gains were made in the 1960s, the barriers to Black people were removed to those policies. Then white people changed the laws so as to not share them with Black people, in many cases taking away their own benefits to ensure that Black people wouldn't benefit from them. Whether we look at public schooling, or we look at mortgage subsidies, or we look at tax policy, or we look at wages, or we look at the social safety net, program by program by program, I didn't even mention healthcare, program by program by program was defunded in face of stereotypes about who would benefit, whether it was welfare cheats, or criminals, or lazy people, all dog whistles about Black people. When in fact, it was white people who were the vast majority of the beneficiaries of these policies. The symbol that McGee uses to best illustrate this dynamic is public pools, which used to be central gathering places and real gems of the public park systems of many cities around the country. But these pools were filled in and planted over after desegregation so that Black children couldn't swim in them. And now, in most places, you have to pay to join a private club or a gym or a synagogue to use the pool. Whether it's education or healthcare or living wage jobs, If we could just share, if white people could embrace including Black people in our public institutions and policies, we would all benefit and we would regrow the middle class. And this brings us back, Lucy, to your vision of the Jubilee that you brought us this morning. Such an important vision, and I love that you called for us to make it happen now. This idea that that's the time when the slaves go free, and that there's a true rest, like the rest that we get a taste of on Shabbat every week, or a rest that we get a real taste of on Yom Kippur every year. When we're able to move past racism and the legacy of slavery, we'll no longer have that gnawing feeling of unfairness that permeates our society, that feeling of oppression and domination and exclusion. The teruah will transform from the wails of crying mothers to the shouts of joy when the chains of slavery are finally really broken, when we have true fellowship across all of our differences, true friendship among all humanity. That's the image of the Jubilee. And then we will sound the shofar as it was meant to sound at the time of the Jubilee. May that come soon. Ken Yiratzon.